Welcome to Project Synapse. We're back. Last week, we gave up the airtime so I could do an interview with Jim Balsillie. It was fantastic. I think you want to take a look at it. And we'll have to do that from time to time. But if we are not on in the Saturday position on hashtag trending, we're always on YouTube. And you can find the show from there. We'll always have YouTube. I found like it sort of sounds like that thing from Humphrey Bogart. Darling, we'll always have YouTube, you know? So,
we'll always have Paris.
Yeah, we'll always
I want to have Paris.
Paris. Oh, yeah, not YouTube. Anyway, so we're back. Welcome to John Pinard, financial executive from Toronto. A big financial executive.
Hello.
Yeah. And Marcel Gagné, open source guru, and now AI. How will we describe you? Immersed in AI. Sort of like
that's a good way to put it. Greetings and felicitations all. It's another beautiful day in the simulation.
How about AI admirals?
Oh, good. We'll do HMS Pinafore next. So as my friend Eve used to say when we'd be laughing in our office, she said, "You youngsters, get down to work." So we're going to get down to work. And the format of the show is we're going to cover some of the weekly news that's come up in AI and have a little bit of a quick discussion about that. And then we try to pick one big topic that we're going to look at. And this week, it's going to be open source AI because a lot has happened. I'm going to start out with a story that started for me with AI being used in defense. And there's a great story this week. The U.S. Department of Defense said that they were using AI to improve their kill chain to get a significant advantage in identifying, tracking, and assessing threats. Now, they're not going to talk about the fact that they actually use this to kill people. And I'm not going to get moral about this, but it really is that they always want to stop short of that. All of the big players had something in their startup document that says will never be used for war and all that sort of stuff. Presumably to appease their employees, to make a statement about something. You can kiss that stuff goodbye. In a Trumpian moment where they all turned up and they're now all partnering with the Defense Department. Meta's partnering with Lockheed Martin and Booz Allen. They'll bring Llama to defense. Anthropic teamed up with Palantir. They'll be doing that. OpenAI quietly removed their statement from their website, and now they're going to be dealing with Anduril and really getting into the Defense Department. And that's a normal American thing to do. Nothing like that. We're not going to change that, and I think that was probably eminently predictable. A Canadian company is now working with another American company called Palantir, and you're going to recognize this name if you've been following the news in Canada. It's Cohere. Cohere's the Canadian startup that was chosen to build the multi-billion-dollar data center in Canada. And they are a Canadian, they're a private company. I was in Toronto this week having a meeting with a whole pile of people talking about where the Canadian economy was going to go in the age of AI, and particularly with what, the tariffs that are being proposed. The Cohere is going to get a grant from the Canadian company or get expense from the Canadian government, and they are a Canadian company, but they're a private company and could be sold at any one time. And they will create this new Canadian data center, which is, the Canadian government is freaking hopeless at doing this sort of thing. They're going to, we might as well get together and grab that $2 billion. Thank God it's only 2 billion Canadian, and we could just burn it now, because here's how this is going to play out. They're going to spend a ton of that $2 billion that is supposed to vault us forward in AI. They're going to spend that on NVIDIA chips, although Cohere will be here and they'll get some money, they will contract to an American firm, they already have, to help them do this. And we'll do all this stuff. And in typical Canadian government purchasing types of arrangements, when it's ready to go online, someone will say, oops, we slipped, we need more money and more time. And think about payroll systems and things like that. It's going to be such a colossal, I hope I'm wrong, but it's going to be a colossal screw up. But even if it's not, and they deliver it, we're going to do what we did with the University of Toronto. Most people don't remember the Jeff Hinton, Ilya Sutskever, all University of Toronto. Yep. Where did that IP go? To Google. Thank you very much. To create OpenAI. Thank you very much. So your tax dollars have created some and helped to create some entities, and they're making hundreds of billions of dollars, and They thank you for it. They might even make a $10 million donation to one of your universities if you ask them nicely. But so before they crush us with tariffs, they're glad to take all these people. And which brings me back to Cohere. This is a Canadian company. What'll happen? An American will buy it. It'll be just that simple. We have given up our AI future. And if we buy this nonsense of this $2 billion of your tax money being flushed down the toilet to make us feel better before an election, we're nuts. Was that a little opinionated?
That was
Not
not
at
a tiny bit opinionated, but do you know how old this is? Like, one of the things that I listened to your interview with Jim Balsillie, and one of the things he said was, this is a problem that goes back, he said 3 decades. I will argue that it goes back a lot further than that. Canada used to have a half a dozen car companies. We built cars in Canada. We had an aircraft company that supplied aircrafts during the Second World War and that built the Avro Arrow. And I am obsessed with the Arrow. I have books downstairs on the Avro Arrow. Like I said, I had a
another
of the Avro
obsession.
Arrow. I am an obsessive person. Okay, let's make that clear right now. But the fact is, the Avro Arrow, where did that talent go? It went to create the American aerospace companies and NASA. Okay, that's where all that talent went. This is not something new in Canada. For some strange reason, we do not seem like the Americans have this wonderful sense of inflated self-importance, of we can just do whatever the hell we want and we're just going to go out there and do it. And as Canadians, for some strange reason, we're like, yeah, maybe that's not really, maybe, it's, I don't know, maybe we, and we're always doing this kind of crap. We're always second guessing ourselves. We're living in a perpetual state of imposter syndrome. It's like, what if everybody notices that we're not as good as we are? Well, what if everybody notices we are as good as we are? This is something that is in our culture. And I don't know how we get past that other than to maybe acknowledge that, yes, it's in our culture, but we're going to do something different this time around. That's my editorializing.
And I'm just going to throw a couple of quick things out about this story about the kill chain. It frightens the hell out of me because we've talked on previous shows about erroneous information coming out of AI, right? I mean, we talked about the simple one about how many R's are in raspberry, and at
Strawberry.
Well, strawberry, raspberry, they all work. But there was 2 or 3 of the tools that we tested that were all wrong. And so I'm sitting there going, okay, these are the tools that you're going to use to figure out where you're going to be sending bombs and the likes. And I hope they get things a lot more accurate before they actually start to.
To be clear, it's a lot easier to paint a target and send a missile onto the target than it is to count the number of R's in strawberry. Just to be clear.
And by the way, for our American listeners, sorry, you just got to hear this because we love you dearly as people. We hate the fact you're trying to crush our country. You only have to crush my country once to make me ticked off. But you elected an idiot as a president, and he's got his finger on the button. I'd rather have AI, thank you, John, than Donald Trump.
True.
You said that.
What?
I've been saying that for ages. I, for one, welcome our AI overlords.
Yeah. But the fact is that this is the 2 parts of this story are that we have an opportunity, and an opportunity that won't last long, where we could actually, there are definitely some terrible things in our culture, Marcel, but there are also some great things in our culture. And if we had our own AI, our own infrastructure, and it's a utility. The other thing I just can't get across to people, the people confuse AI with data. And they really think of it as, they're trying to think of it the same way we manage data, sovereignty over it, all this sort of stuff. AI is a utility. It's something that does something. And we could have our own utility that creates wealth the same way rivers do, the same way land does, and all those sorts of things. We could have that utility. The data, that's a separate issue, and how you manage that. And it's easy to get confused with it. But
you mentioned some of our clever people in AI, Hinton and Suskiver. One of the things, actually, Hinton is still in Toronto, isn't he?
Since he's left Google, I think he's still hanging out in Toronto because he's offered to do a couple of things in one of them was
Right.
help to repair the Science Center roof. So I think he's still around, but yeah, he's just an exceptional guy who
Yeah.
walked away from it all.
One of the interesting things that was done is the US tried to hobble China by saying you can't have access to these high-end NVIDIA chips and so forth. So China said, screw it, we're going to figure out a way to make this work with the lower end stuff, with the stuff that's less expensive, with the stuff that isn't the bleeding edge things. And this week, like a few days ago, they uncovered they released a reasoning model into open source. And again, I know we're going to talk about this in detail, but that is on par with what is being generated with the billions of dollars in OpenAI, like the tens of billions of dollars. And as I understand it, they did the whole thing with like $5 billion or something like this. It's like an insanely small amount of money. And then, of course, there's another model that's being developed, as you know, where they trained it using 8 of the high-end NVIDIA chips for $450 over the course of a week and a half or something like that. There is absolutely no reason whatsoever.
Sorry, that's exactly what I was talking about. Was
Yeah.
a different way to do this. What are we going to do? We're going to make Jensen Huang, Richard, buy all NVIDIA chips. Really great idea. Google's going to develop their own chip. AWS is developing their own chip. OpenAI is developing their own chip. I'm sure that Meta has development of their own chip. And what are we going to do? We're going to buy from NVIDIA.
But I don't see a problem with buying the chips from somebody else if we develop our own technology to go along with it. You said yourself that AI, is a service. It's like a utility that is available to people.
Yeah.
We can buy the hardware to provide and generate, that utility here in the country without having to buy it from the United States. I wanted to avoid talking about Trump on this, but he made this big, bold pronouncement saying, we don't need Canadian lumber. We don't need Canadian energy. We don't need Canadian oil. We don't need anything that Canada has to offer. Well, you know what? Like, we've got all this stuff. And maybe we don't need to buy our AI services from the US when apparently China figured it out. Apparently, it's relatively easy to do this for a lot less money and have something that comes from your own country. That is, again, in this case, open source, which, obviously is, as you like to point out, John, one of my obsessions.
Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, he was so big into this week that there's nothing you can do about that. I mean, Trump also signed an executive order repealing all of the safety measures that Biden put in place. Now, you can be political about it. I don't need to be, but there is now officially no safety measures. John, you were worried about how this is going to play out.
Oh, yeah.
They don't even have to report anymore. The safety measures Biden put in place said you must report on your training. You must say what you've done. You must have a plan for safety. And that's all gone because the Republican platform, I guess, or the Trump platform was that'll just get in the way of progress. Safety gets in the way of progress, which is exactly what we've been saying for a long time, is once you crank this up and you have no safety, now all of the things you're worried about probably come true.
Well, and this is one of the things that I think I've talked about before, and I had in the notes for today, is that security and safety of information needs to be built into every single step along the way. It can't be an afterthought. It can't be we'll deal with that later. And it feels like, and okay, so we've been talking about Trump. Let's talk about Ford for a minute. The idea of, do things fast. It's better to get things out fast, the housing and all the rest of it. But is that they're taking out all of the guardrails just so that they can get things to market fast. And that scares the hell out of me because you don't know what you're going to end up with. I mean, Jim, you and I talked briefly yesterday about my concerns about DeepSeek, is that the Chinese government has always said that all the data that resides within China is theirs. And so concerns that I have about using DeepSeek is what you put into it and where it's going to reside. Now, it's open source, so if you can get it and take it and install it on a server or something outside of China,
Let's hold that
Sorry,
idea
go ahead.
because we're getting into a bigger discussion about
Okay.
that, and Marcel's going to want to jump in. Let's finish the stories, and then we'll because I don't want to shortchange that. GPT went down this week. Another piece of news when they announced the day after they announced this $500 billion project. What is it called? Project
Stargate.
Yes,
Stargate.
Marcel, that's right up Stargate. That's science fiction. That's right up your alley.
Stargate SG-1, one of the greatest shows ever.
Yeah, I remember. I remember that one. But so they announced Stargate, and then ChatGPT goes down. They did this during the 12 days of Shipmas too, where they made a big announcement that ChatGPT goes down. They really have to watch this. Although it did reinforce the point that they need to invest a lot more in infrastructure.
Yes. And just tied in quickly with that, one of the stories that I had was that OpenAI has launched Operator. And if you watch some of the videos, Marcel, the video that you shared with us yesterday, as they're presenting it, they're telling you that, it's still a work in progress. There's errors, there's going to be bugs, this, that, and the other thing. You need to make sure that you get these things fixed because they've now launched it. It's now available for pro users. And
yeah, $200 a month, but they do call it a preview. They make it very, very clear that this is in development, that there will be bugs, that there will be issues. You shouldn't use it for anything mission critical. They're making all of those things. And
that's true.
And okay, at the risk of throwing the security, concerns under the bus here, John, I do think that there is something to be said for a little tiny bit of move fast and break things, okay? And the reason I feel that way is there are so many things that are moving incredibly quickly around us, and we are stuck in this way of doing things that says, well, we have to put it before a committee, we have to discuss these things and so forth. And by then, the whole world has changed, and we have not adapted to it. If we're going to accept that these things are happening and they're moving fast, we need to develop a mindset that says that we also are going to move fast. If things are changing around us, we have to change with them. And even the concept of putting on the brakes has to go through a freaking committee and an investigation and being talked about. So, yeah, things are moving too fast, perhaps. But we also need to move fast in responding to these things.
Totally agree. I don't accept the dichotomy. The one thing I said at one of the meetings I was at this week, my son lost his job. He's a video editor. He's an incredibly talented young man. He was working on an educational series that was done in Toronto on YouTube. He's also done editing for a lot of the shows out there. You would see his work. Is he better than AI? Yes, absolutely. But the cost of doing this with AI is just so low, nobody can resist it. So he is one of the first victims of this. And if you think that this is going to happen to your kids over and over and over again, you are nuts. I don't want to tell my kids in 10 years when they have a lower standard of living than I had, or maybe we're the 51st state, or maybe we're just crushed. I don't want to tell them, what did you do, Dad? I developed a strategy, son. So, but this dichotomy is not necessary. And it's the idea of, they've done it in the States where they've got woke and they've got right wing. We don't need either of those things. And the Biden plan, I'm not doing a Democratic thing. The Biden plan for safety was perfect. Be transparent. Tell people what you've done. Report on it. Let people see it. Let great minds go in. It's not the Canadian, the woke solution of having 60 committees. So 5 years from now, we can discover we didn't get into AI. We can't move at that speed. That's just not acceptable.
No.
But transparency, architectural principles that demand that you build safety in. We can do these things without the committees and without that sort of hand washing where everybody will find a reason why you don't do anything. That's why Canadian government can't do procurement. They all get together and I don't know what the American government is like. I've never worked. I have worked on Canadian procurement. They all get together and talk about the rules and how they have to enforce the rules. And the process of procurement becomes the whole game. Forget the system. Forget the outcomes. The process of procurement drives that. And how are we doing at that so far? Not very good.
Yeah.
But this is one of the reasons that I loved, the whole open source mentality and that I got into it, all those many years ago, is this idea that, first of all, we're moving fast often, and we're releasing things into the public that is still in development, that is not necessarily, gold standard quality. But the fact of the matter is it's open. Everybody can take a look at it. Everybody can respond to it. And in some ways, I think that the making sure that if you make sure that everything is always working absolutely perfectly, I don't think anything ever gets done. But I think there is a place and a world in which we can release things and we can say, like OpenAI did. And again, I'm not trying to put them on a pedestal here, but releasing something and saying, look, there's this really cool new thing, this agent technology that we're releasing out into the wild, but understand it's got problems. Understand it's being released as a preview. And yes, we may choose to start building things on top of it, but that's on you. Okay, because we did admit up front that this is buggy and it's got problems and you need to have intervention. And it even built in some of those safeguards, as in, it's not going to just pay for things without you approving it first.
But Marcel, and John, I want you to chime in on this from a security point of view. The open source model is not perfect, but it's the best of the lot. If you compare it, and I'm not anti-Microsoft, but if you compare the security of Linux and the speed of development and the amount of money that Linux would have cost to develop versus Microsoft's operating systems, and you compare them in terms of number of bugs, number of insecure things, the method of developing under Linux or open source when it works is a way to do this.
Yeah, and look, I have spent time with the provincial government, and I hear you with the rules and the meetings and all the rest of it. I'm not suggesting that, but I am suggesting that there needs to be methods put in place. I mean, the same way back in the good old days when we used to sit there and write computer code, part of your process was testing it. A lot of this almost feels like it's not being done as much anymore. We used to talk about alpha testing and beta testing. Yeah, I think that that's really what OpenAI has done with this operator, is that they've released it sort of for beta testing, which is fine, as long as it gets done.
Alpha testing.
And it's alpha, really. Yeah. And I think it's like most Windows versions. It's alpha,
Yeah, but I think the security side of things is no different than the testing, right? It's you build all of this into your processes, that as you're going through to develop software or tools or anything like that, there are certain rules that you need to follow. And one of those rules needs to be making sure that it is safe and secure.
Have you considered also the possibility, though, that, there was a time a gazillion years ago where, when I had my first car, that even I was able to open up the engine and change my spark plugs and do an oil change and stuff like that. And now this stuff has become so ridiculously complicated that I have to take it to a dealer to have that happen. In the world of software, we're talking about systems that it's not like there are, 10 or 12 or, a couple dozen different processes that are happening. And we just need to make sure that those half a dozen or those 24 processes work perfectly. There are hundreds of thousands of things happening simultaneously. I honestly think that when you've got systems that complex, the only way to find out is to release it out into the wild and see what happens. And I know that's scary and terrifying, but I don't know that there's any other way other than bringing millions of eyeballs into the process.
No, and I would agree. And to me, it's not really scary and terrifying if it's being done the right way, in the sense that, we've talked about alpha testing or beta testing. If that's the way that it's being released, not that it goes out there and oops, well, we'll figure things out as we go. Right.
Yeah.
That, to me, that's a big difference.
And that has happened to software. That has happened to software. I maintain we used to, you can be fast and then you can make speed the only thing you think about. I have a software program I use. I've ragged on about this before. Last night, they changed everything as I'm editing. They changed everything in the editing program. Now I've got to figure out where it is. I have to figure out all their bugs and all that stuff. If they had told me, here's the stuff we're going to do. Do they have to do it once a week? They don't have to do it once a week. Once a month would be fine. If they had just said, we got a beta version, as other software does, we got a beta version, here's how you click back and forth, check it out for us, tell us what you think, I'd be pleased to be part of the testing. And
That's the right way to do it.
That's something we can
Yeah,
do.
absolutely.
And if you've got the greatest minds in security and you release these programs to them, to the people out there, there's lots of people who love. One thing about IT, you're not short of people who will find your mistakes and criticize you for them. That. If you release this out to a whole pile of people, they will tell you for free what you screwed up in the software and your life, probably, if you give it a chance. Let's go back to the stories. I want to get to this. So one of the other things that came up this week, we did a story on it, was ChatGPT funded the math benchmark. Speaking of transparency, they funded the math benchmark that they used to show that O3 had made huge gains. This is, there's nothing in this story that told me that they actually used this as a way to game the benchmark, except that they had a deal with the people who developed this new benchmark or the new testing, and they I called it a pinky swear. They just said, "Oh, we won't use this in our." There's not even any documentation on this. And then all these mathematicians developed all these things without knowing that OpenAI was funding this. Nothing wrong with this, like I said, but talk about lack of. We're going to have to change the name to closed AI because they really are getting good at this.
Have you heard, though, there was an article I was reading yesterday that there is a new benchmark tool called Humanity's Last Exam.
Oh, I love that. Yes.
And they said that they went through and tested a number of different AI tools, and none of them scored better than 10%. So
yeah, I saw that. You raised the story. I love the title.
Yeah. I don't know a lot about it other than same deal. They are planning on releasing this to the research community because they want the research community to look at what they've built, figure out whether there's bugs in it or not. B, figure out how these AI tools can actually improve to score better. So
yeah, now one of the problems I have with this exam, I like the idea behind it, but if it's the one I'm thinking about, the idea is to basically try to always come up with things, the next thing that only we can do that the AI can't do. And, eventually you run out of questions on that sort of thing. Can I give a nod to another podcast? Am I allowed to do that?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely.
Anyway, it's not so much it's a YouTube channel, but there's a guy named Philip who runs a channel called AI Explained. And I think he does a fabulous job on this thing. I'm on his Discord as well. But he is working with a couple of other people to create something he calls Simple Bench. And Simple Bench, the idea is that all of the questions in Simple Bench are things that, and I think that this is an interesting way to do it, are all things that are easy for people to do. Okay, so in terms of trying to figure out just where models are, on the way to AGI and so forth, it's like, these are things that are easy for humans to solve. Like, as in humans look at them and go, oh yeah, but the AI struggles with it. And in some ways, to me, that's more interesting than, can you come up with an answer to this complex problem?
Yeah.
It's more, how good are you at inferring things that are simple for us as human beings to be able to do? And that's a slightly different approach than, let's put all the greatest PhDs in a room together and mash them all together and create this superhuman intelligence, that is still somehow human. And a classic example is this one. It's like, you have a pot sitting on a hot stove, and then you drop in an ice cube. Every minute you drop in an ice cube. 1 minute, drop in an ice cube. 1 minute, drop in an ice cube. After 5 minutes, how many ice cubes are in the pot? Okay, and with exactly a human being comes up with that, whereas most, and now AI models are learning these things as they go along, okay, but the AI models would, at first we're going, well, obviously there are 5 ice cubes in the pan.
None, because
the pan is sitting on a hot stove.
Yeah.
Which brings us back to another one of our stories this week, which was that AI apparently is not very good at history. And there's a story on that. By the way, for people who are listening to these and you want to check out these stories, it takes me about a day or so to get the show notes up from this show, but you will find the links to these stories if you want to find them. But AI is apparently not very good at history.
They really are like us.
Yeah, so it has had an achievement. It's really crappy at history. Like, I'm sorry. No, I'm not gonna mention whoever it was who said that they had airplanes in the American Civil War. You were going to say something, John.
No, I really like the idea of this
Simple bench.
Simple bench. That if you look at it, we've got large language models and now we've got small language models, and they serve different purposes. And I like the idea that if you build a simple bench that says, for me doing my job, I'm not a PhD, I'm not going to do research, but here's the types of things I do that are more than adequate to be assessed by simple bench. Versus, I don't care if an AI can't, solve, medical, can't pass the bar or can't pass the medical exams, because I'm never going to use that. And if you've got a tool like Simple Bench that does, I'll call it everyday type assessments, I think that's great.
But that's just it. But what it's trying to do is measure reasoning more than anything else. It's like, is this model able to reason? So it's not built for those day-to-day things, despite the name, okay? It's built to provide, questions that would be relatively easy for a human being to solve because it requires the type of reasoning that we have. So at some point, like, I honestly believe, and I've stolen this quote many times now, but the AI system that you're using today is the worst you will ever use. It's just going to continue to improve. And at some point, we will be sitting at artificial superintelligence, and none of these discussions are going to matter because we will have gone past the singularity where we are no longer able to keep up with the technological development that comes out of this stuff. It is going to happen at some point.
And that's why if our focus is business, and this is where I get down to, we're obsessed with large language models, we're obsessed with AGI, we're obsessed with superintelligence. I would go back to the engineering principle of fit for purpose. And that's when you're talking about AI, a corporate setting or an organizational setting, you should be concerned with one thing. Can it do the job well? Can it do it better than a human? And the fact that it can't solve world hunger is irrelevant. And it's like the saying, I always say this in security, and we do this, and this is one of the reasons why these committee things break down. There's a feeling that if we can't do everything, we can't do anything. And that's why cybersecurity fails. We can't afford cybersecurity. Yes, you can. Get decent long passwords, but that's not everything. It's something, do the next thing, get MFA. And pretty soon you'll find out the 80-20 rule is a wonderful thing.
I was just going to say, I've always said technology for business sake, not for technology's sake. That this has always been an IT thing that, IT guys love tech and we love to put things in. But I've always said, what is the benefit to the business? If it doesn't have a benefit to the business, it doesn't belong here. It may be great technology for a different business, but not for our business.
I would argue that sometimes, however, you don't know whether it's going to be useful until you actually bring it into practice. So I'm not sure that I agree with that 100%. One of the things that I think every once in a while we need to sort of square away is that, we talk about AI as though it's one thing. And then, you mentioned, Jim, the idea of, the tool for the job. There are AIs that are really, really good at this. There are AIs that are really, really good at that. And we have sort of wrapped ourselves into this idea of the monolithic model that can do everything, as opposed to here's a fine-tuned piece of software that can handle these sorts of things. The people that are freaking out on artificial intelligence showing up in everything today, yes, I follow the AI haters subreddits as well, just to see what the enemy is thinking. Did I say that out loud? Anyway.
I'm more Pogo. We've met the enemy. It is us,
But yes, exactly. But the fact of the matter is, none of this is actually new. We have been using artificially intelligent software for decades now. What's new is these monolithic things that seem to be magically capable of doing everything and talking and reasoning like us. That's
Yeah.
new. But that's not every AI. That's just, these monolithic models.
But I'll tell you why this gets in the way. And I'll give you an example from not from AI, but from quantum computing. Jensen Huang, Mark Zuckerberg stood up and said, it'll be decades before we have quantum computing. And a company in Vancouver said, excuse us, sir, we already have quantum computing and we're using it in industry. It's just not the type of quantum computing you're talking about. D-Wave has sold their first quantum computer. They are using quantum computing, a different type. It's called annealing. It's not gate method. You can get into what that means. But the reality is they're using it. And I feel the same way about AI, is that, if we're waiting for that perfect AI, if we're waiting for that artificial super intelligence, and that's going to keep us from implementing things, we're going to miss something. And I'll go to the last story, and then we want to get into our discussion. I got a survey from a company called I4CP, and they surveyed 1,000 organizations, and they found that what's the major differentiator in AI? This is a quiz, guys. So Jeopardy. I'll hum the tune to Jeopardy. What's the major differentiator in getting results from AI? Dum, 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 dum. It's training.
Yeah.
Companies that believed that they were getting great results, they could improve their productivity by over 30% with the tools we have now, were those who focused on training their employees and training their executives. And they were, the ones that were successful were 2.5 times more likely to have trained their executive leaders on Gen AI, and 3 times more likely to say their executives use Gen AI. And you've talked about this, Marcel. Just get out and use it. Just get out and train on it. And so we're all waiting. And I think everybody in IT, where you go into a meeting with business users and they say, we want to use it, but we don't know how.
Yep.
Well, you know how. You do. Get a hold of it and start playing with it. There's lots of people to help you do that. Don't wait till you can do everything. You do something.
No, absolutely. And we've talked before that I'm deploying Copilot in our organization.
Yep.
And we're deploying I call it the free version, but it's the one that comes with our E5 license. And the reason why I'm doing that is that becomes the playground. People can go and play. They can see what the art of the possible is and what they can do with it. And there are limitations, obviously, with that free version. And if they want to get a license for the pro version, they're going to have to kind of provide sort of a business case as to what the purpose of it's going to be, right? It's not just across the board, everybody gets pro licenses at $40 a month per user. We'll give you access to Copilot. Go figure out what you want to do with it. And then we can work on how you get to the next level. No problem.
It was my GoFundMe going, by the way.
I don't know. Yeah. So anyway, that's sort of our look at the news. And as I said, if you're listening to this, I'll put a list of the stories. Many of them are published on Tech News Day. Others come from other places, and I'll put links to those for you. And that'll allow you to actually go in and read the story and find out that we were wrong. No, I'm kidding. I did want to talk about this because this hit in a big way. We've talked about it in many things, but I want to focus on that. And that's because I want to have this discussion with you guys about DeepSeek. And it dropped onto the market this week. Now, Marcel, you've been playing with it. So why don't you start with the background on it?
Well, DeepSeek actually had some models that had come out before this. The reason that it was a big deal this week is that they released the R1. So DeepSeek D3 was already out there, and it was already available for people to play with. And it was, their version of like GPT-4o or something like that, is where the comparisons were. R1 was their reasoning model, the one where you have the model actually think through the steps of the questions that you're doing. And one of the things and when you do that, when you basically say, think step by step, okay, when you say that to a model, you tend to get better results because it pauses and says, okay, I'm looking at this, but if I do this, then this will happen. So perhaps I should look at this instead. And then it walks through all the steps and thinks this through. Now, the downside, of course, is this is a more time-consuming thing that you could get an answer like that off of. R1 is fascinating because, first of all, it's open source and open weights. Like everything that's necessary to rebuild this model has been released by this Chinese company in the wild.
Can you just go into that,
And-
Marcel? I don't want anybody to miss that. For people who are listening who might not have followed this. Open source and open weights. And the weights are important. That's the key. You can open source. The code for an AI model is actually really not that big, but it's weightings and the vectors and the weightings that really make it work. That's a big deal.
Well, the weights, I mean, if you want to think of it in terms of a human brain, when we learn something, we reinforce certain connections. It's like muscle memory when you're playing an instrument and so on. What you're doing is you're reinforcing the signals in a particular area so that the response there becomes stronger. And weights in a model are similar in the sense that as it goes through and learns these things, it says, oh, there's a reference to this that shows up more and more often, and literally more weight gets put on these particular tidbits of information. And this is not something that you can go in and take a look at. But those weights are effectively what constitutes the model itself that you then release out into the wild. Now, there are a few things that are interesting about R1. R1 is done entirely using reinforcement learning. And the way that you can think about that is is it Deep Blue that was taught to play Go? Okay.
Yeah.
It basically, instead of learning all the moves the way that Deep Blue did originally to, chess games and so forth and everything like that to eventually beat Kasparov, what they did with Go is the model played itself over and over and over again and learned the game. That is reinforcement learning, but that was reinforcement learning for a specific game. Typically, a lot of these models work reinforcement learning with human intervention. In other words, it's like, it learns all these things. Is this correct? Yes. And like flesh bags go in and basically say yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, to make sure that the model is learning properly. What's interesting about DeepSeek is it's 100% pure reinforcement learning with no humans in the loop. So this thing was taught basically all the facts on the internet, how to reason things from first principles. And that is new. And that is really cool and exciting.
And I want to go back just to go back over the development of this, because this is, you talked about this. Deep Blue was IBM's creation, and they taught it to play chess.
Yep.
Again, a rules-based thing. It could absorb all the rules. They taught it to play Jeopardy. It could assemble a whole pile of facts. I'm not taking anything away from this, but there's a problem. Then later on, I think it's the guys from Google.
Yes, DeepMind,
who taught it to play Go. And they used a different strategy. And that's the one you're talking about, where it would just run every possible strategy and learn and simulate them.
But against yourself, like playing yourself, play games against yourself over and over and over again.
And the adoption of that is one of the reasons why IBM is not as far ahead in AI. It's great for machine learning and all that sort of stuff.
Yep.
But this method of learning by playing against yourself and trying this is absolutely new, but it's probably 8 years old or more, but it is powerful. And it ties into a chain of thought too, doesn't it? Like this whole thing was adopted, this chain of thought that I'm going to reason my way through things to make them more accurate. But the cool thing that I saw when I was watching some of the demos was it would tell you its chain of thought as you went through it.
Interesting.
So in the early releases of 01, you would see some of the messages go by, in the preview. It's like, I'm thinking this, but it would skip an awful lot of things. I've been playing with R1 quite a bit. I've spent far too many hours playing with it so far. But if you ask it a question, and 01 is interesting, obviously we don't have a picture here, but when you look at it, there are two buttons at the bottom. One of them is a button for reasoning, and then there's another button for search. And the button for search is, if I need to, I'll go out on the internet and I will look up information for you. So it does have real-time access to the world. So you can use it for that. If you've got the reasoning button on, you can actually see, and it's just this flurry of steps going down the screen as it says, okay, I've been asked to do this, but if I do this way, then, I might not get the optimal result. And then it goes on and on through all these various steps of thinking. It is fascinating to watch. You can't possibly read everything that's going by as it's doing it, but it's fascinating to watch that happening. It sounds like that inner monologue that you've got in your head as you're working through a problem. Just absolutely fascinating. And it's fast, even in reasoning mode. It feels like it's fairly quick. The other thing that it's got to is there are things that it can execute internally on its own. For instance, I did a mortgage calculator. I said, create me a loan calculator that's suitable for mortgages. I want to be able to run this as a web page with JavaScript and so forth. So it generated the whole thing for me. And then there was a button that says, run the HTML, where you just click the button and then you've got the page and you can actually work with the software on your screen, fully generated, fully, available to you. And then, of course, if you want, you can then, take the HTML, copy it onto a server somewhere and run it if you want. So to me, and in some ways I've found, in some ways it is more accessible. The other thing that's really cool about it is where it took tens of millions of dollars to train the OpenAI version of this thing. They did this for something like $6 million over a very short period of time, using the chips that the US the US said it's okay, you can use these like old fashioned chips and so forth, but you can't use the leading edge chips from NVIDIA because we don't want you, this evil superpower, to have access to the technology. I think all we've done, all the Americans have done, is push the Chinese to be just that much more clever.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to give them too much here, but I almost feel like the Chinese understand the dangers of this kind of power being put in the hands of one government, and in particular, obviously, the United States in this case, and have decided that if they can't match it, they're going to make it available to the world. Now, the version that they run over there obviously will limit you to some searches because, it doesn't want to say anything anti-Chinese. But, well, exactly.
Nice,
but the
nice
thing is, you can actually, because you can take the model and put it elsewhere, you can correct for that depending on where you happen to be running it. And what they've done is they've distilled models. So what you do is you take the big model and you distill a smaller version of it. And then you take the smaller version to distill another smaller version of it. Like there's a 1.9 billion parameter model that they've distilled into, which you can actually run on your own PC. There's a piece of software called LM Studio that I have actually run here and run the model on it, and it's not bad.
Well, no, and let's put these into perspective for people who may not follow this. 1.9 billion parameters is like it's a drop in the bucket. You run it on a laptop. Yeah. It's tiny.
You can run it on a cell phone. If you've got a reasonably powerful phone like this thing here, you can
19, 20 billion, still you're in the land of technology you probably have in your house. 671 billion is where the full model is. You could still contribute to Marcel's GoFundMe, and he'll buy a couple of those NVIDIA processors, probably about 2 of them, and it'll run that. So you're still in the land of a budget you wouldn't want to tell your spouse you spent that much money on, but you probably could buy it easily. Now, when you get into the couple trillion model, then you start to talk about big hardware. But that's the amazing thing that the Chinese have done is this can be run on normal chips in hardware that anybody could afford. Are you listening, Canadian government? You do not have to spend $2 billion of the money. Contribute it to Marcel Gagné's GoFundMe. He will build you a small model of AI that we could use across, we'll call it the Canada AI.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, Canada.
You want to look at that. But I will say that at least it's a better name. And Operator that you talked about, John, at least if we're going to name AIs after 70s songs like Jim Croce's Operator, I think that's great. Yeah. So DeepSeek, also another decent name. The Chinese have done another thing. They've given something a decent name.
Yes, they have. There's a guy out there on the net, and I do not remember his name, but I remember him talking about it on social media. He's building himself a cluster of Mac Minis. I think like 20 Mac Minis or something like that. So he's building a cluster of 20 Mac Minis to run the big model. The biggest of the distilled models, not the one that requires a data center, but the biggest of these distilled models. And he plans on running it locally on this little cluster of Mac Minis.
These new Mac Minis.
So the University of Toronto could do this stuff. Western University could do this stuff. All of our major universities could take one of these models and use that as a centerpiece for their AI programs.
Yeah. If you're going to compete with people who are really good at something, And let's say the big money models were never going to beat the U.S. at. And I've heard this so many times. We can't possibly beat them at this. We can't possibly do this because we have a couple billion, they have hundreds of billions to invest. Don't play the same game. Find a new way. And that's where you have to admire the Chinese. By the way, you've got one reason why you think they launched it. I think they did it to mess people up. Because I think what a great statement to make, is you're looking for $500 billion and maybe several $1 trillion, Sam. Here's your 4.0 model, and I'll raise you one. Ours is free. Now, Elon Musk has been fighting with Sam Altman and trying to buy up all the NVIDIA chips he can do and saying nasty things about him and trying to, but the
watch
Chinese,
the battles on Twitter. It's entertaining.
Oh yeah. But the Chinese have come in and just looked at this and went, hey, you can have that for free. And I think that's a more dangerous type of competition. You have to admire them for this. And I agree, the fine tuning. Oh, sorry, John, you want to jump in?
No, I was just going to say, I think they're kind of slinging mud in the Americans' face that says, fine, you don't want to give us access to these things? We'll do it. We'll do it better. We'll do it cheaper. We'll do it faster. And we don't need any of your technology.
Yeah. And, which is a heck of a statement.
It's a hell of a flex. You got to watch China. You can't ignore them. They are leading the world now in electric cars. They are leading the world in robotics at this moment. There's a clip, I don't know if I shared it yet, of this wheeled 4-legged robot that they've got doing the most amazing sort of stunts. It's absolutely incredible. The Chinese, if nothing else, they're showing off their technological prowess with off-the-shelf stuff as opposed to buying the biggest and baddest of everything. And it's going to be really interesting. Like I think the battle, so to speak, for supremacy in this is definitely between the Americans and the Chinese. But having access to some of these cheap things means we can all get into the game.
And the Chinese have done this before. People don't realize this. If you go through, and everybody's talking about, we're going to get Huawei out of our networks. Sure you are. You're not, and you didn't.
No.
The Huawei technology is across the globe. While we were sitting pounding our chest going, Nortel, and everybody in the U.S. was going, we've got all this technology, the Chinese quietly built a phone infrastructure around the world. And this is the other piece, two things that's going to happen. One is that they've been really smart about the places they want to prop up in Africa, other countries around. They will bring them this AI technology, which Canada could have been doing. We abandoned Africa. At one time, we were a big force there, and China went in and owns half the continent now. But the other piece, and I don't want to stay on geopolitics, the one thing that this does do, though, Marcel, is it releases in a big way. We've seen these open source models, but this is the Pandora's box is now open. Like,
oh yeah.
This is now, forget this idea of you're going to regulate it, you're going to keep it regulated. It is out there now. It's not going to go away. And so everybody in the world can have access to a sophisticated AI model, which they can fine tune. And we've talked about fine tuning. Don't dismiss fine tuning. You can do an incredible amount to get a model to be an expert in anything. And Sam Altman said with 12 questions, you can do with a very little training, you can make these models very specific and very expert. This means that AI is now in the hands of everybody.
Well, and I'm just going to tack on to that by saying that DeepSeek, deep as in DeepSeek.com. So chat.deepseek.com will get you there. They also have released an API where you can, use it to create your own things using their back end. And here's the cool thing. It is 27 times cheaper. They say 25 to 30 times cheaper, but 27 times cheaper, so we'll put it in the middle, than the O1 model from OpenAI. So you can use this now to build your stuff at an insanely cheap price.
Yeah.
And if you want to have your own environment to build on top of, there's an open source product out there or a company out there called Open Router that actually allows you to connect to the chat bot without having to go through the Chinese system purely on an API basis. And like you can throw in a couple dollars in there and it's going to keep you going for months. Like it's just
So
amazing.
forget Marcel's GoFundMe. You can have a bake sale and run this AI. This is revolutionary. In my mind, this week, I don't think we really appreciate the implications of the fact that AI is now democratized. Anybody can have it. You can fund a project with your kid's allowance in terms of tokens.
And next week, everything will change again.
It seems that the U.S. and so forth, they're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars for things AI related. And then you've got tools like DeepSeek that you can get for free or for pennies to be able to do the same kind of thing. And yeah, I mean, I have my cybersecurity concerns about things running in China, as a lot of people do. But the idea that it's open source and that you can take it and install it elsewhere and then check the code to make sure there's nothing hidden. But to me, that's the best of both worlds, is that you get it dirt cheap and you can host it wherever you want.
Now, you'd have to check a lot of code. How would we check a lot of code to make sure that, what would you do to do that, Marcel?
Well, if we could develop an artificially intelligent system that could work its way through all that stuff.
At one time, if you got a set of complex code, and like you said, weightings are vectors, these is not something where you're going to get be able to do a walkthrough of the program. That's not going to happen. And being able to inspect all that code, the beauty of this is you could use OpenAI's API to inspect this code. I mean, you could go to somewhere else independently and check it out, because one of my concerns would be, like the Chinese have done with Huawei technology. I don't think it's a secret that, like they've done with TikTok, they report back, and there's no question about that. So I would want to check this code out to say what in it might report back. I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah, I mean, there's automated testing tools out there that have been around for years, but they're very expensive. And, the idea of being able to utilize AI to do your automated testing, I mean, it makes things a lot cheaper, potentially a lot easier to do, and a lot more manageable for a lot of other companies rather than the ones that can afford these big tools.
If I was running a testing tool company right now, and I developed all of that massive scripting that I don't think ever worked, sorry, but I used to run testing, and I don't know how you could support. The overhead of supporting the testing tool was way bigger than its benefit in many cases. I'm not
Yes,
totally.
I would agree.
But now with AI, you can develop testing in a way that I think would add enormously to productivity. How do you guys feel about this? And Marcel, you were making a joke that next week something else big will happen. I agree with you, but I do believe that this was a landslide. I think you'd call it a real pivot point in terms of the development of AI.
Yeah, I agree. I think I want to see honestly, I'd like to have bigger hardware so that I could actually experiment with it locally. But I've done things where I ran code generation with the model here. And it's not as fast, obviously, as doing it online, but it was relatively impressive, even at the 1.9 billion parameter model. And I really would like to see things like this being deployed in other places so that we're not reliant on, again, the Chinese infrastructure. I mean, if the model is being run somewhere else and you have access to where the data is being stored, it's pretty easy at that point to make sure, to address John's concerns here, that the data is not being fed back to a foreign power. So I think this is all doable, and I think this opens the door, and we haven't had an open source model. We've had a lot of open source models up to this point. Llama has been out there, but Llama was kind of like the only one. And now we've got something that, seems to surpass that, and it's a reasoning model. And we will probably see Llama's reasoning model next week, at this rate. But yeah, it's exciting. This is a cool new time.
Well, and it creates some real competition too. I mean, that's the problem, is that there's only been a few players in the market that have really kind of led things, and they're not cheap. And so now you get something like DeepSeek that's at, in the same level of playing as these other tools, but it's dramatically cheaper. that it makes it more accessible for those that don't, whether that's individuals or countries or whatever, that don't necessarily have the same kind of funds.
I don't want to just lay this all at the feet of DeepSeek here, because we tend to think that everything is happening in the US, with Grok and Meta and OpenAI and Microsoft, which is basically OpenAI as far as this stuff is concerned. But we do have other development projects out there. Mistral in France is one of the big ones. Don't write that one off yet. And they are an open source one. The point that I guess I want us to sort of latch onto is not that there's this Chinese model that we can use that's so great, but that it's possible to do something other than ride on top of these large players that we're used to thinking of as being the only game in town. And that's always been the beauty about open source. People would say, well, the classic joke was, which distribution should I run? Well, run the one that your friends are running, because then you can ask for help, But the point is, having a choice is great.
Yeah.
And choices are hard. It's a lot easier to just say, tell me what to do. But having a choice is wonderful. And having a choice puts power in your hands. I think I could practically wrap it there.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to wrap it. Like I said, I didn't want to make the show political, but I don't know how you escape that. I'm terrified of 5 idiot billionaires controlling my destiny by controlling. And Sam Altman said it best. He said, the compute is the new currency. In other words, you'll use one of these 5 models. And in 20 years, we look back and say, we dodged that bullet. It will be because of open source. And that from my lips to God's ears, I used to say, now I say my lips to Steve Jobs' ears. This has been great. And I think we'll pursue this more as we go through this. Thanks to my co-hosts, Marcel Gagné and John Pinard. If you in the audience have more questions, or you want to argue with us, or you want to have an opinion, or you want to, whatever you want to do, you can contact me at editorial@technewsday.ca. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, you can leave a comment on YouTube. We respond to them all. And you'll find it in the notes, you can join us for the conversation that we have during the week on our Discord channel. And we'll post a link in the show notes to our Discord channel. That's about it. Any last words, guys?
Live long and prosper.
Well, it's the start of an exciting time ahead. I think we could say that every week.
Yep.
That's right.
Yeah. And my comment to you all is, thanks for spending your time with us. You're spending part of your weekend with us. We thank you for that. Have a great weekend, and I'll catch you with the tech news again on Monday morning. I'm your host, Jim Love. Talk to you soon.